Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty fundamental, I think you'd agree. Quality of life.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
what does that actually
Yeah.
mean, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like a big idea, but when we break it down, our guide here lays out the key ingredients. It's got to be about your physical health, the connections you have, socially, like how secure you feel in terms of your job and your finances, and then the environment, a healthy planet. All of these things sort of have to come together, right, to create a good life.
Exactly. And it's not just some fluffy concept. This deep dive that we're doing, looking at globalization, sustainability, and like the whole political economy thing, it's going to show you how these big ideas actually show up in your everyday life.
Right, like the air you breathe,
Yeah,
your job opportunities, all of that.
absolutely.
But how do we even like measure quality of life, right?
Yeah.
There are these things called indicators. So economically, we can look at GDP per capita, basically how much wealth is produced per person on average.
Yeah.
We can look at employment rates, how many people have jobs. Socially, we look at literacy rates, life expectancy, access to education. Environmentally, it's about clean air, clean water, using resources responsibly. And then politically, we're talking about human rights
Yeah.
and stable governance.
Right. And you can see how all these things kind of connect with each other.
They're all intertwined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you've got a strong economy, it can fund better schools, better hospitals, which leads to a more educated and healthier population.
Makes sense.
But then on the other hand, political instability, that can really mess up economic progress and undermine social well-being. It's this whole web.
Yeah. Okay, so our guide also talks about how new ideas and innovations, like across history and today, have changed our quality of life, but not always in a simple way. Like, think about antibiotics.
Right.
Huge for public health, right?
Yeah.
Like, totally increased how long people live.
And the impact of that was huge, right? It changed life expectancy globally. It's just one discovery. Shows how innovation can really improve our quality of life.
Exactly. But then take the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing for learning, connecting. We've got information at our fingertips.
Absolutely.
But the guide also points out, like, the downsides.
Right.
Cyberbullying, misinformation spreading like wildfire,
Totally.
which can really mess with our mental health,
Yeah.
our social well-being. It's a double-edged sword, this stuff.
So then the question is, as societies, how do we get the good stuff from new technology, but also deal with the downsides? It's a constant process of adapting and thinking critically.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into globalization. It's this huge force shaping the world. Basically, it's how countries are becoming more and more connected through trade, communication, culture, everything.
Yeah.
The guy gives this great example. A company in New Zealand, they outsource their production to India to save money on labor costs. And that means we get cheaper, fresh clothes.
Right. And that example, it shows you how globalization really works. There's the economic incentive to cut costs. You've got the technology to communicate and coordinate across the world. And then you get cheaper goods for consumers.
Yeah, so there's the economic impact, but also the social side of it, for workers in both countries.
Exactly.
So what are the pluses of globalization? Well, our guide says it gives us access to way more stuff from all over the world.
Right.
And communication's way easier with the internet. Like, you can talk to people across the globe.
Absolutely.
And it's driven economic growth through trade, big time.
So theoretically, that economic growth could mean more resources for things like infrastructure, public health, for the countries involved.
Right.
But the question is, are the benefits shared fairly?
Good point. Now, of course, there are downsides to globalization, and the guide doesn't shy away from that. One worry is that local cultures might get eroded as global brands and media become dominant.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's worker exploitation, especially in developing countries.
Right.
Like the fast fashion industry.
Yeah.
You get cheap clothes, but it often means people are working in terrible conditions for very little pay.
And thinking about the environment, that fast fashion model puts a lot of strain on it, right? All those resources being used, the pollution from manufacturing, the emissions from transporting things around the globe.
Right. It's a real problem. So it's complicated. But the guide also says that people and governments aren't helpless.
Right.
Like, there's fair trade products. People are choosing to support businesses that treat workers fairly.
Yeah, it's about consumers having power. By choosing fair trade, they're saying, this is what I value, and pushing for better practices, even if it's a small step.
Yeah, and governments can do things like tariffs on imported goods. The idea is to protect local businesses from being undercut by cheaper foreign competition.
But then tariffs can sometimes lead to other countries putting up their own tariffs in response, which can hurt other parts of the economy. So there are trade-offs to consider.
Okay, let's move on to sustainability. The guide defines it as meeting our needs today without messing things up for future generations.
Yeah.
Like, a good example is switching to renewable energy sources, like solar and wind, instead of relying on fossil fuels that will eventually run out.
And sustainability forces us to think long term, right?
Yeah.
Our actions today have consequences that last beyond our own lifetimes, especially when it comes to the environment.
Absolutely. And there are some real benefits to going sustainable. We protect resources like clean air, water, healthy soil. We reduce pollution and all the health problems it causes. And it can actually lead to innovation in green technology, creating new jobs and industries.
And that all connects back to quality of life, right? The
Totally.
healthier environment means a healthier population, better communities, a more secure future.
Yeah, it's all connected. But going sustainable isn't always easy. Like the guide says, renewable energy can cost more upfront than just sticking with fossil fuels. And you've got industries that are super invested in the old ways of doing things, so they resist change.
Take banning single-use plastics to help the oceans.
Yeah.
It's a good idea, but it might face opposition from companies that make plastic and even some people who are used to the convenience.
Right, so like with globalization, there are things people and governments are doing. On a personal level, you can choose to use reusable stuff instead of disposable, like bringing your own water bottle, your own shopping bags.
And that's a good example of taking personal responsibility. While big changes often need to come from governments, lots of individuals making these choices can really add up.
Yeah, and governments are implementing things like carbon taxes to try and reduce emissions by making it more expensive to pollute.
But then how do you make sure that the costs of going green aren't all put on lower income households or certain industries? That's a tough policy question.
Okay, let's talk about political economy. It's basically looking at how economic factors shape our quality of life.
Right.
So think about it. Your wealth, your income, whether you can get the things you need, what job opportunities are out there, these things are huge. The guide contrasts Canada and Haiti. Canada
Yeah.
has a relatively strong economy. Haiti faces a lot of economic challenges, and that affects things like healthcare, education, basic infrastructure.
And those kinds of comparisons really highlight how important a stable economy is for almost every aspect of life.
Exactly.
Access to clean water, medical care, things we might take for granted, they can be a daily struggle in places where the economy is struggling.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. Even within countries that have strong economies, you often see this big gap between the rich and the poor. That's what the guide calls economic disparity.
Right. And that brings up the question of what a fair distribution of resources looks like.
Yeah.
How big can that gap between the richest and the poorest get before it starts to break down society and hurt everyone's quality of life?
Right. So the guide looks at why this gap exists. Some of it has to do with natural resources like Saudi Arabia with its oil reserves. Then there's education and skills.
Mm.
If you've got more education and specialized skills, you're more likely to get a better job and earn more money.
Yeah.
Government policies like taxes and social safety nets also play a big role in how income is distributed.
Right.
And of course, globalization, as we talked about, creates both opportunities and challenges that can make inequality worse.
And don't forget about conflict and instability.
Right.
Those can devastate economies and drive people into poverty.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle.
Mm.
So what can we do about economic disparity? The guide talks about some solutions. Governments can set minimum wages, create social programs like Canada's healthcare system, employment insurance, social assistance, and use progressive taxes where richer people pay a higher percentage.
Right.
International aid organizations like the UN can provide help to developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are economic policies that aim to boost trade, create jobs, and invest in education.
So it's this multi-pronged approach, right?
Yeah.
Domestic policies, international cooperation, and focusing on sustainable growth that benefits everyone.
Makes sense. Okay, now the guide shifts to political factors and how they affect quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
Political decisions affect everything from human rights and stability to economic growth. The guide compares stable democracies like Germany to countries that have problems with governance like Venezuela. And you can see a difference in things like access to healthcare and education.
So a stable and just political system is really the foundation, right? It allows all the other aspects of quality of life to flourish.
Right. If you don't have good governance and the rule of law, it's really hard to make progress in other areas.
Exactly.
The guide talks about political stability, which means a government that's running smoothly without major disruptions like revolutions or corruption. It says that this kind of stability tends to lead to economic development, better protection of human rights, and more foreign investment.
So what makes a country politically stable?
Yeah. Well, the guide compares Canada and Sudan. Canada's political landscape has been pretty consistent. Sudan has gone through periods of upheaval.
And it's not just about the absence of conflict, right? It's also about having effective institutions, a fair legal system, and a sense of trust between the government and the people.
Right. So what contributes to that stability? Effective governance, where the government is transparent and accountable, that builds trust. The rule of law, so everyone is treated fairly by the legal system.
Mm-hmm.
Economic conditions matter too.
Yeah, if a lot of people are unemployed or living in poverty, that can lead to unrest.
Right. And social and ethnic divisions, especially if they lead to discrimination, can be destabilizing.
Mm.
And external factors, like we're seeing with the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, can have a huge impact.
Yeah, it's this complex interplay of internal and external forces that shapes a country's political environment and the safety and well-being of its people.
So what do we do when there's political instability?
Well-
Well, the guide points to peacekeeping efforts in diplomacy, like what the UN does to try and resolve conflicts.
Yeah.
Democratic reforms, like free and fair elections and fighting corruption.
Mm.
And sometimes the international community uses sanctions, like what's happening with North Korea, to try and put pressure on a country.
Right. But intervening in these situations is tricky. There are no easy answers, and you have to think carefully about the unintended consequences.
Okay, so bringing all this together, the guide really emphasizes that we need to understand these interconnected issues, the economic, the political, the social, the environmental, if we want to improve quality of life.
Absolutely. It's not enough just to identify the problems. We have to analyze why they're happening, understand how they affect different people, and then come up with smart solutions.
Right. So to help us do that, the guide introduces all these key terms and concepts, like fundamental ideas like perspective, opinion, values, fact, and bias. These are crucial for thinking critically and understanding why different people might see the same situation so differently. And then it goes into the different aspects of globalization: economic, technological, political, cultural, environmental.
Yeah, it's about seeing the big picture of globalization. It's got all these different facets, positive and negative, across different areas of life and the environment.
Exactly. And we learn about different worldviews on the environment,
Right.
like the expansionist worldview, where nature is basically seen as a resource for us to use, versus more ecocentric views like biocentric and deep ecology, where the whole ecosystem is valued in itself. Understanding these different perspectives is key if we're going to solve environmental problems sustainably.
And then you've got the pillars of sustainability,
Yeah.
the social, environmental, and economic dimensions. It's about finding solutions that work for all of those areas.
Right. And we talked about indicators before, like GDP per capita, the Human Development Index, the Gini Index, which measures income inequality. These are ways to measure and compare quality of life across different countries, whether they're more economically developed or less developed.
Right. And these indicators, they're tools for analysis, right?
Yeah.
They help us see trends, understand disparities, track progress, but they're just a snapshot.
And they don't tell the whole story.
Exactly.
And there's the political economy stuff. We learn about the economic sectors: primary, secondary, tertiary,
Right.
and historical concepts like colonialism and the mercantile system, which have shaped the global economy.
Understanding the historical context is key, right? It helps us see how we got to where we are today with all the inequalities and the debates about globalization.
Exactly. We learn about different types of economies:
Mm.
traditional, market, command, mixed, and economic ideologies: progressivism, protectionism, neoliberalism. These are different ideas about the role of government in the economy.
And those terms give us the language to talk about economic disparity and analyze its causes and consequences.
Right. And then, unfortunately, there are terms like extreme poverty and aid fatigue, which show the ongoing struggles with global development. Finally, there's a bunch of political terms: nation-state, sovereignty, borders, which can be natural or just made up,
Right.
political stability, and ways to measure it, like the Political Instability Index, different ideologies, communism, fascism, capitalism, socialism, concepts like nationalism, autonomy, and then some darker terms like failed state and ethnic cleansing. These are all important for understanding how the world works politically and how that affects quality of life.
Yeah, they give us the tools to talk about political issues,
Mhm.
understand power dynamics globally, and analyze the factors that lead to peace or conflict, and whether human rights are protected.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive. Quality of life is complicated. It's all these economic factors, social connections, the environment, political systems.
Right, and all of those are constantly changing because of globalization and innovation.
Exactly. It's like this huge interconnected web. When something changes in one area, it affects everything else.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? It's this dynamic system that's constantly evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to think about. Given everything we've talked about today, what one change in your own community do you think would make the biggest positive difference for quality of life? And why?
Hmm.
Think about it. Maybe even do some research.
It's a good question.
Yeah, something worth exploring.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's it for our deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.